Good morning, y'all. How you doing? So listen, I'm going to tell you right now, there's nothing you're going to hear from me that's going to compare to what you just heard from Fat Joe, from Dr. Dyson. But these leaders you're going to meet on this panel, what they have to say, what they have lived through, the work that they are doing today, this will inspire you. This will stay with you for all of your days. I promise you that. So let me introduce them now one by one and give them a warm welcome as they come out, if you don't mind. We're about to meet survivors of people who've either been killed at the hands of police or victims of wrongful convictions. These are their family members. These are folks at the forefront of activating for change. The first panelist joining us right now is Nicole Paultre-Bell. She's the fiance of Sean Bell. Come on over, Nicole. Many of you probably know Sean's story. He was unarmed. He was leaving his bachelor party the night before their wedding, and he was shot and killed by police officers in New York City in 2016. Nicole is an author. She's an advocate for social justice, mental health, and police reform. She's appeared on major media and at the United Nations. Welcome, Nicole. Mr. Victor Dempsey. He serves as a community organizer at the Legal Defense Fund. His advocacy and his activism within New York and nationwide were launched by the tragic loss of his brother, Delron Small, who was killed by an off-duty police officer in Brooklyn in 2016. Victor, thank you for being here. And Danroy Henry Sr., known as Dan, is, as you all know, a distinguished presence in the fight for police reform. He's also the father of Danroy Henry Jr., who was just 20 years old and a student at Pace College when he was murdered by a police officer in Thornwood, New York in 2010. Dan, thank you for your presence. Also with us is Violet Martin. Now, in 1997, Violet was just 15 years old, and her brother, Brian Betts, and her cousin, Celeste McKinney, were wrongfully convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to 25 years to life. That has propelled Violet's work as an advocate to this day. Let's give them a warm welcome as we take a seat. So, I know we've all been talking backstage. I feel like I've gotten to know everyone a little bit better. You all have known each other for years, and each of you were not only forced to endure a tragedy that launched you into the work you do today, you've also had to navigate the criminal justice system, the system, in the name of your loved ones. And before we jump into the legal part, I just want you to have a moment to share with everyone here whatever it is you'd like to share about the moment that brought you to this work today. Nicole?
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for being a part of this really important conversation. So I see there's a lot of young people in the room, so I want to kind of give you a little bit of backstory. 17 years ago, I was 22 years old, and I was getting ready for my wedding day, happiest day of my life. A lot of us, we think about that, and we imagine and fantasize what that day would be like. A mother of two young girls. My daughters were 4 or 3.5 and 5 months at the time. And being in a relationship with Sean, we had a beautiful relationship. It was the day of my wedding, literally the morning of my wedding, when I woke up to find out that as Sean was leaving his bachelor party with his friends and his father, who was there in attendance, there were undercover police officers, plainclothes detectives, who were investigating the club that he had been partying at with his friends. They were investigating the club, not Sean and his friends, for club activity, things that happen in nightclubs. Sean and his friends were not aware of this. They enjoyed the night, had a great time. At the end of the night, as they were leaving their party, there were the plainclothes detectives who were in the club, blending in, doing what everyone else does in the club. Ultimately, the 50 shots were fired at Sean and his friends as they were leaving the party, getting into their cars. There was a huge outcry from our community, from our nation. And this was 2006. It was long before many of the movements that you see now. So for me, as a 22-year-old young woman with 2 young babies, waking up on my wedding day, learning that my husband-to-be had been killed, it was devastating. I couldn't imagine what I was going to do next. We had people in town for the wedding. Those people ended up staying for the funeral. It immediately, I wanted to just crumble. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to speak. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I shut everything down. But then there was lots of media attention that started to come around. There was a groom that was killed on his wedding day, 50 shots fired by undercover police officers. There was a narrative that was beginning to come out about Sean. And they hadn't met Sean. They hadn't met his family or any of his friends. And after a lot of consideration, I realized that there was something that I had to do. There was something that I had to do that was bigger than me and bigger than my problem. And he was not here to defend himself. So I had to answer the call. And for me, that call was standing up, telling the story. And it's been 17 years, and I'm here today. We fought like hell. We've been through a criminal trial with complete acquittal of all detectives. There were 5 detectives involved, 5 plainclothes detectives. Even a supervisor was on the scene when it happened. 3 out of the 5 were indicted. They were acquitted on all charges. Following that, there was a federal investigation for federal civil rights violations, criminal civil rights violations, and we were told there wasn't enough evidence to prove malice. But Sean had the civil right to make it home that night. He hadn't committed a crime. He hadn't. After that devastating news, it was several more and more procedures, the civil suit, and then the departmental hearings, which is the police investigating themselves to determine what the outcome will be for these detectives. At the end of the day, one of the officers, the one who initiated it, he was fired. He was terminated. The others were allowed to retire with full benefits. And since then, I've been picking up the pieces. My daughters are college age now. I've been able to find strength in many ways, but part of it is by sitting here and talking to people like you and allowing myself, or you guys allowing me to share my story, but not forgetting that each and every one of us have a story, and we've all been through something. So I gain strength just by knowing that if I can share a little bit of me and help one of you, to me, that's justice. That's success for me. So thank you.
Nicole, thank you. Thank you for being here. Victor Dempsey, what would you like to share?
Before I even share, I want to give my condolences. But also, I'm from Brooklyn. I was raised the Brooklyn way. We show love, you know what I'm saying? But I do want to show love to other families who are in the building today. Uncle Bobby, Aunt B, what's up? I see y'all. Angie, Joshua, Cervantes in the building as well. It's a few folks here, and these are not victims, but these families become warriors. They're still the folks that are left behind to pick it up and tell these stories. So definitely want to give a shout out to them. But also too, last of a shout out before I get into my story is, we just recently, there was a historic bill passed here in New York City. So I really want to give a shout out to the Clean Slate New York team. For those of you who don't know, this bill was passed, historically signed into law by the governor, and this will help folks with previous convictions and perpetual punishment be able to move on with their lives by erasing those convictions. So shout out to the Clean Slate team. Want to get them in. But yeah, unfortunately, I got into this work roughly 7 years ago after my brother was murdered and stolen from us. My brother is what a lot of folks call an alpha male in every sense of the word. And when I got the call, it was 4th of July. Obviously, I'm with family, my kids, and popping fireworks. I didn't even have my phone on me, and I'll go back to look at my phone, and I seen all these missed calls and text messages from family members I ain't speak to in years. I'm like, what the hell y'all calling me for? Excuse my language. But then when I checked it, nobody wanted to tell me what happened. They just said, yo, bro, you got to get to Brooklyn. You got to get down here now. I'm like, all right. And all I heard was, oh, it's your brother. Still didn't know what happened, nothing. I'm like, all right, I'm coming. But as I'm going through all the other messages, I'm starting to see distant relatives reaching out also. And when you know something is off and that pit in your stomach just dropped and that wave of emotion came over me. One of my good friends, we hopped on the highway, we drove. We took off. And I remember pulling up. This was in Brooklyn on Atlantic and Bradford, right by Pennsylvania Avenue, for those of you from the city. It's a big intersection, and it was about 4 blocks just cordoned off each way. And my boy just pulled up, slammed the brakes, I hopped out, ran through the yellow tape, almost got tased. It was nuts. But I was there maybe half an hour before I found out that my brother was still actually laying there, murdered. But nobody told me because I'm thinking I'm coming down and I'm calling folks, asking, what hospital am I going to? Where am I showing up at? But losing him, having him stolen from us, lit a fire within me. Not a fire of pity, but a fire of, I have to get to the truth. I wasn't there. I didn't see what happened. I don't know. But the story, the narrative that came out of it, that also didn't sit right with me. Because we all know our family members. We know who's capable of what in our families. You know what I mean? But the way the story came out, I said, absolutely not. No. My brother was driving from a family barbecue with his then 4-month-old son in a car, 15-year-old niece girlfriend. Like, no, he's not going to do what they said he did. No, not in front of our family, not in front of the kids. So literally, for 8 days straight, I found myself humanizing my brother in a moment where mainstream media, law enforcement, was trying to dehumanize him, bringing up his past, bringing up his records, bringing up us growing up in foster care, all this, everything that had absolutely nothing to do with him being stolen from us. So I think in understanding what they were projecting is what gave me the impetus to say, no, he has a voice. I've learned so much about my brother, even with him being stolen from me. But what I had to realize was, if I didn't control the narrative, my family didn't control the narrative, if I didn't listen to the other families that's in this room today to help guide us to what we need to do, his story would have never gotten out there. And lo and behold, I say 8 days because the way my brother was murdered, there was video footage that nobody knew was there because the owner of the business was out on vacation. So you had this officer's narrative initially that came out. Then 8 days later, we get a video that completely contradicts that story. But unfortunately, I'm still here today doing this work because sometimes video isn't enough, as we've all seen. When you see it with your own eyes, folks are gonna take it, taint it, twist it, and turn it until you see what they want you to see. So even with that video, the officer was charged for murder charges. We went to trial. My family and I sat through it. And unfortunately, this officer was acquitted. And the reason why I tell the story the way I tell it is because me being an advocate, it wasn't just for my brother's life being stolen, but I sat through that trial and listened to our peers, as in a jury, who are not educated in legal genre, who don't understand the legal genre. Yes, some of us may understand it from different ways. I myself am formerly incarcerated as well. I've been there on the other side of it. But not understanding that language or having the insight to interpreting it is why that officer was acquitted. And that's what made me want to become an organizer, to come back, not only fight for my brother, but educate myself to in turn help educate my own communities so we're not behind the 8 ball anymore. The only ways we can advocate and change the narrative is to know how to do it. But I'll stop there because we got a lot of dope people here.
Victor, thank you so much. We don't want you to stop. We're going to come back and talk more about this. But Dan, what would you like to tell us?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming out. So our son, and I say our son, but I'll tell you in a second, DJ Henry is an amazing young man. We keep him present, so I'm not going to say was. He is an amazing young man. We have 2 other children, Amber and Kyle. I want to acknowledge them as well. But it's really important to me that you understand that my wife, who is sitting right here, Angela Henry, is in the room. She is my partner in fight and in life. And I want to make sure that you know that she's sitting here. And everything we did together. So our son was murdered. He was murdered by a person who was, at the time, a police officer but should not have been. He was a New York City cop. They moved him from New York to Pleasantville because he wasn't really fit for duty. He was there to do no harm, and instead he took our son's life. And when he shot our son's car because he thought he heard someone tell our son to stop when our son was told to move out of a fire lane, our son, remember, was complying with what he was asked to do. If he didn't comply, he'd be alive today. He moved his car because they asked him to move his car. And this guy decided that somehow in moving his car, he became a threat, moved in front of his car, jumped on the hood, and shot our son through the windshield. He was shot, by the way, by another police officer in the road behind him who saw him, that police officer, as the only threat. Pretty clear, right? Like, how could you not prosecute that case? Well, things get in the way. Right? People who have political ambitions made the decision. Janet DeFiore, I'm going to call her up by name. She was the Westchester County DA. She had political ambitions to become a judge. She became a judge later on, resigned in disgrace recently. This is all New York stuff. You can look it up. She decided that she wouldn't really prosecute the case, so she accepted what she was given as fact, even though it wasn't fact. Chief Alagno at the time, who was the chief of police, issued a statement that morning that was given to him by his lieutenant, Brian Finelli. These names are important. Brian Finelli had ambitions. He wanted to become the chief of police. He wanted to replace Alagno. Brian Finelli wrote a false statement, issued it to the media before we even met with them, saying that our son was being shot at by these 2 police officers because he was driving recklessly. False. Brian Finelli became the chief, and then shortly after becoming the chief was convicted himself for trafficking in what? Child pornography. Now he's a convicted felon. Alagno retired, got his pension. We asked to meet with Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo wouldn't meet with us. We asked him to take action. He had us meet with Mary Cavity, his head of public service. We said a couple of things about the meeting. We need to make sure this is investigated independently, that there's an independent prosecutor, that it gets moved out of Janet DeFiore's jurisdiction. Well, guess what? Some of those changes now have happened in New York. That we need to make sure we can see grand jury minutes because we know that Patty Murphy, who was in her office prosecuting this case, told me 2 weeks before it was done that he's going to get off if he comes to testify. And I said to her, ADA Murphy, how do you know that? If you're not presenting a case to get to what they call a no true bill, how do you know that? And she couldn't answer the question. Why? Because she knew what she was doing. We can't see those grand jury minutes because that law changed in New York after, and it's not retroactive. So it's important that we understand the specific actions that we need to take. Right? We never said this was about race, and we got a lot of heat for it. You know why we never said that? Because they know that playbook. They know that playbook. So what we said instead is we want absolute truth. We're seeking absolute truth. If the facts support the justified use of force, we'll deal with it. If they don't, then he should be held accountable. And we have to begin to think about the narrative, right? Because they give us space to play the playbook the way that they've designed the playbook to be played. And so we have to disrupt it in order to make progress. And I know we're going to talk more about justice. I really want us to think about liberty. Liberty, not just justice. So I hope we'll come back to that.
Dan, thank you. Violet, over to you.
Woo. All right. My name is Violet Martin. My brother, Brian Betts, and Celeste McKinney were wrongfully convicted in 1998 of a 1997 homicide. The victim was the nephew of the now known corrupt detective Roger Galewski. My brother Brian Betts and cousin Celeste McKinney had no criminal records. At the time, Brian was 21. He had just had a son who was then 6 months old. My cousin Celeste had no children. So imagine you being sentenced on your 22nd birthday. I was 16 at the time my brother was convicted. And my moment of I'm going to fight came from my mother. She walked up to my brother after the sentence of 25 to life. And my mother said, because the deputies, they're told not to allow the family to touch or speak to them. But the deputy looked at my mother and said, go ahead. And my mother said, it is not written in stone. We are going to fight. So at a 16-year-old, and my mother would touch me, and she always spoke blessings over me. And I say that because in the inner city, black mothers don't really embrace their daughters. They push them. But the boys, they tend to hold tighter. But when my mother spoke that over me, you gotta understand, speaking blessings over your children, and I see the youth here, take those blessings as jewels. And my mother also in those words said, I'm sorry, baby, but you gotta grow up a little quicker. I gotta rely on you a little bit more because we got this 6-month-old baby. And I had my sister, and we're a year and a half apart. And when I took that, I was like, man, but she still allowed me to be a child. I played sports, and I had my first job at McDonald's and things like that. But when she said, come home, I had to be at home because she was a single mother and she worked nights. So my nephew, he grew up, and I thank God for that because a lot of times when children's fathers are gone, that family doesn't embrace their seeds. But we didn't grow up in a family like that. But I can tell you this, the PD infiltrated my family. They used my uncle, who was about 10 years older than my brother and my cousin, to testify against them. Do you understand the fracture that does at family events? Do you understand what that makes you do and look at your family to where you shun? So you don't have that surrounding that protection. And recently, in 2020, I was met by some leaders from Moore Square, the Metro Organization of Racial Equality. And at the time, these are strangers. I don't want to tell them my story. You know why? Because I was still dealing with pain from 1998. But then I realized, I asked God in 2014 to start surrounding me with leaders, people that had positions to hear my voice, to hear my family. And I reached out to these people, and my mother, she was with me. And Brian called on speaker, and we start telling that story again because you get tired of telling the story. We want action. And they said, when y'all want to do it? We going to protest. And we made flyers up, and these complete strangers, white people, Asians, Hispanics, do you know they stood on that courthouse stair with us? And it was only 10 people. But we didn't stop there. We did that in September of 21. And then we made another loop around. And we decided every Tuesday of them warm months, we sitting out there. And it went from 10 people to 40 people to 50 people. The amazing thing is, my children, my brothers, nieces, and nephews, my husband, who is from Queens, they stood on them stairs with me. And I showed them something that our family hadn't been doing. If I gotta be that Harriet Tubman, that Moses, that Sojourner Truth that I read about in 3rd grade, then damn it, that's what's gonna happen. And I thank God for Trisha Bushnell with the Midwest Innocence Project. She called me 3 weeks ago and told me that You guys were looking for someone to speak. And like I said, in 2014, I wrote it down. God, please start building me up. Surround me with people of intelligence, of power, to build me up. And not to be scared of learning and not knowing everything. And he said, see yourself there. That's what the doctor just said. See yourself there. Don't rely on his opinion of you. See yourself there. And I seen myself here present. I am not just Brian Bett's sister. I'm not just a mother. I'm not just a daughter. I am a powerful woman. And I don't want to just talk about it. I want to be about it, and I'm ready to go hand in hand. We armor up. But I give glory to God, and I thank you all.
Violet, thank you. Can we just acknowledge here for a moment, this is not the first time they have had to come out and talk about their families and talk about their work, but the strength and the fortitude and the perseverance that it takes to keep showing up and leading in this way is worth showing some love right now. So please give it up for our panelists. I do want to bring in two more people to the conversation now, and we'll all continue this conversation as well. But let's give a warm welcome to two more guests who will come out now, Josh Dubin and Dr. Patrice Collins. Josh is the Executive Director of the Perlmutter Center for Legal Justice at Cardozo Law. The Perlmutter Center works to free the wrongfully incarcerated and individuals serving unjust sentences. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Patrice Collins. She's Assistant Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on children with incarcerated family members. Thank you both for being here. Josh, I'm going to start with you and just ask you to reflect on what you have been hearing from each of these incredible leaders, how it relates to the work you do, and specifically some of the issues they run up against in the criminal justice system, whether it's jury selection, grand jury transparency, failure to acquit when the evidence seems clear. How much of this is state by state and how much of it is systemic?
I'm a crier, so I'm trying to compose myself. You know, I just want to honor all four of these family members because I was telling Dan and we were talking backstage, and the work that we do, the strength that we get is from your strength because nobody can really empathize with you. We can sympathize, but I'm in awe of all of you. And I think that it's so important that as attorneys that these are the you hear these brilliant, intelligent voices that had to go through unimaginable circumstances to be able to stand up. So I wanted to take a moment to honor you. I think, to answer your question, look, whether it's on a state-by-state basis or it's a more systemic issue, national, there's no accident that everybody sitting on this stage to my right is a person of color. It's not a coincidence. And I think the small steps that I try to make are making sure that you are not afraid to piss off a judge, that you are not afraid to piss off a politician, that you are not afraid to speak truth to power. To me, the biggest problem in our society generally, and certainly in our criminal justice system, is that an entire civilization was plucked from their homeland and brought here and enslaved and told, okay, now you're free. That doesn't fix itself. So what I continue to see is I sometimes feel overwhelmed because it seems like it doesn't matter if I'm in Kansas, where I've been, New York, Oklahoma, or California. I was just in Kansas recently on a case that we were talking about, and it was a white girl that had accused a black man of sexual assault. It was a highly publicized case, and at one point during the hearing to try to get him exonerated, I asked the state's witness, isn't it a fact? Because I had all this evidence that she made it up. I had her text messages. It was all literally a lie. And after having presented that evidence, I said to the state's witness, isn't it a fact that the incidence of false accusations of a white woman accusing a black man skyrocket when there has been evidence of what's called malingering, which is faking symptoms of a psychiatric harm, and there was overwhelming evidence of it. And the judge stepped in, and she was an older white woman, very matronly, and she said, what are you doing? Race had nothing to do, that you're trying to inject race in a case. And I said, Your Honor, we have to recognize that systemic racism is the reason why this DA in this county has case after case after case where people of color are being accused. I had sweat going down my back by the time I was done with the argument. She finally said, you get one question if you can lay a foundation. I said, isn't it a fact, ma'am, that the incidence of cross-racial false accusations skyrockets? And she said, yes, there is. I've read those studies. So all I can say is that, and we ended up getting him exonerated. And I don't want pats on the back. I actually, it's not the applause, I appreciate it, but I just think that we have, and when I say we in the arena, we have to make sure that in those moments, instead of saying, all right, I'll move on, we speak up and speak out. And then honor, when they get out, honor their strength and honor their story, and just keep on trying to take as many baby steps as we can. And I think that, to me, it's not a state-by-state issue. It's every state has this problem. And I think speaking up and speaking out, is the first step in my mind to trying to make change happen, and not worrying so much about, am I going to anger someone or piss someone off? Just tell your truth. So I hope I answered your question.
Dr. Collins, tell us what's on your mind as you're hearing all this, because your work on the generational trauma in particular, I think, is relevant. I should also point out, when all of us had a phone call last week, and I remember, Victor, you in particular, saying before you began talking how hard it was to sit and listen to everyone else, even as you're carrying your own trauma. That is part of the burden of this work, is that you're constantly living in it. But Dr. Collins, tell us what's on your mind as you're hearing everyone speak.
Okay, there's a lot of things on my mind. I think one thing that is pretty prevalent in the conversation today is children, right? Like people's loved ones, adults that were children, and the trauma that is experienced when you have a loved one that's abruptly removed by violence or by incarceration, which is also another form of state violence. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys sharing your personal stories. I think that's really important. And when we think about humanizing the topic of incarceration and the topic of state violence on Black people, specifically thinking about Black children that are growing up in communities where it's normalized to have a parent or a loved one removed from the home. And what does that look like for children that are dealing with inconsistent housing, inconsistent caregivers, inconsistent social emotional development in general, which is so important for children that are going to develop into adults, right? So when we think about these issues around like gun violence, around adverse police contact, around our criminal legal system and disproportionate injustices that we're experiencing, that were discussed today. we can't forget about the children that are also in these households and in these families, and what stakeholders that are invested in the well-being of children and families are considering as it pertains to children of the incarcerated, children of families of survivors of gun violence in general. I will just say that hearing the stories is very compelling. I think we need to also amplify the voices of people impacted by the criminal system, and also those that are invested in children. So when we think about early educators, when we think about the educational system in general, there's a lot of children in classrooms today that are experiencing having someone either arrested in front of them or going to the prisons and jails to visit their loved ones. Fat Joe referenced it. You know, how they treat their family members at the time of visits also can be traumatizing, right? So how do we think about policies to support officers' understanding of how they can reduce the amount of trauma that children may experience at the time of the arrest or at the time of a gun violence interaction, how we can think about supporting correctional facilities and their understanding of how we can foster family relations and not deter or hinder it by, you know, enforcing things that would prevent or prohibit their wanting to go visit their loved one, right? And then when we think about the court system too, and like literacy and understanding, there's a lot of families that have a lot of anxiety about even going into the pretrial hearings to see their loved ones, right? But that's an opportunity for a visit or an encounter that was mentioned, you know, thinking about your mother and how she was able to contact your brother, and even though that's not common where you can, you know, have that conversation, but the opportunity was allowed. But just thinking about the nervousness, anxiety that families feel, how can the court system provide maybe a family advocate to help families that are dealing with, you know, generations of having family members in and out of those court settings? And then when we think about post-incarceration and family reunification, how do we support children and families when they're dealing with that long-term disruption, and now you're bringing family members back into the family? So there's a lot of complexities when we think about the different stages of incarceration and the impact on children. But I think just hearing the stories today and thinking about, you know, millions of children that are experiencing what you guys have all referenced today, I think really uplifting how we think about investing in those children's well-being and overall sustainability in this society that we have when we're thinking about the social problem of mass incarceration.
Nicole, Dr. Collins is mentioning the impact on children, and you mentioned how young your kids were. And it strikes me that when a tragedy like this hits, it changes your life, but life doesn't stop. You have to go on being a mom. You have to go on picking up this fight in the name of your fiance. So I want to bring this back a little bit to the criminal justice system, where a lot of the conversations are focused today, and just ask each of you briefly, if you can, when you're thrust into this system and you suddenly have to figure out how it works and what levers to pull and when to fight and how to fight, what surprised you most about being thrust into that system? Like, what do you wish you knew back then that you know now?
I think based on what Dr. Collins said, you basically hit the nail on the head. I've raised my daughters almost now 2 decades since they lost their father. And it is an everyday, in every situation that I have to kind of redirect and make sure that, okay, what you're going through, is this something that's really on the surface, or is this something deeper? The generational trauma that happens not only with the incarcerated, but those who are killed, and in our case, killed by police officers. It never leaves. It never leaves you. And once you've been a person who've experienced depression is always with you. It is always with you. You can do things to cope. You can go to therapy. There are many things that you should do if you've been affected, even as a child. But there is still that underlying issue there that has to always be worked on. And for me, my daughters were very young. Now they've grown up watching me fight, but there has been times when, even down to the school, I raised my girls that, okay, your dad passed away and, he went to heaven, and it was a very long story. And then you'll have kids who are like, oh, your dad is, that's not the truth. Your dad is dead, So it's an everyday fight, an everyday battle. And we have to remember that when families go through this type of loss, or even with incarceration, the media comes around and maybe there's a story on it. But every day the families go home and deal with the trauma. And I think what most surprised me is just that thinking that depending on the justice system, relying on the justice system to do what we are all taught in school, that we will all receive justice. You know, there's a pledge that we learn as a child in elementary school. You have to stand up and say the pledge. And for me, I grew up knowing that, okay, when something's done wrong, someone will be held accountable. So for me to learn that there are actually human beings that can wear a certain uniform, that can take your life and be able to go home to their family members as if nothing ever happened. And we are left to pick up the pieces. That, I think, was the most surprising for me, is just knowing that, what am I going to do with this? What do I do now? What do I do with my daughters? There couldn't be, I guess, there wasn't many conversations I could have with people who had been through what I had been through, even at that young age. I remember having to sit down on the side of the bed with my daughter, of her not understanding why this happened, and having to coach her to say, hey, what we're going through, we don't know how many of your friends have experienced trauma. Not everybody talks about their trauma. You're not alone. For us, you know, mommy's very vigilant. And for me, that was my healing. That was my therapy, and still is. But sitting down and explaining to my children, one of my daughters who never got a chance to know who her father is, she was 5 months when he was taken. So there is always the question of, you know, why isn't my dad able to pick me up from school? Sweet 16s, graduations, for the rest of their life. And yes, I've been able to do amazing things. I've been able to move on and move forward with my life, but there's still the area of accountability. And if it wasn't for my daughters, I wouldn't be here. My daughters are the reason why I'm on this stage right now. My daughters are the reason why I pick up the microphone, why I stand at a press conference. If it wasn't for my daughters. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Victor, you mentioned narratives. You mentioned having to seize control of a story that was not accurate, that was not the brother that you knew. Was that the thing that surprised you most about what happens immediately after a tragedy like that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you lose someone, when someone's stolen from you, I guess human instinct, you think that you have time to grieve. You think that you have time to think about the loved one and hold on to those lasting memories, so that's not the way you remember them in death. But no, and these types of state-sanctioned violence, you're thrust right into it. You're thrown into the fire. A lot of the families I know, we didn't ask for this. None of us asked for this, but we have to do it. And I think one of the most interesting things to me was understanding the network. What I mean by the network is even just looking at this room. We've got folks sitting down, everybody's trying to get in. But when I say the network, I was blessed, and I don't want to say blessed, but I was honored to have, the day after my brother was murdered, impacted families showed up for my family and myself. Literally, I'm not joking. I laugh at it now because it's a great memory that I had. It was Gwen Carr, the mother of Eric Gardner, Cynthia Howell, the niece of Alberta Sproul, Hortensia Peterson, Akai Gurley's aunt, Carolyn Gray, mother of it. I hate to keep name dropping, but 2 days later, after my brother was murdered, we had a vigil by the area of where he was murdered. And unfortunately, my brother was murdered in front of a family barbershop that we owned. So I'm in the barbershop, and folks come inside and say, hey, Vic, it's some superheroes looking for you, literally. That's what they said. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But I come outside, and I see 6 women just wearing white, all of them. I didn't know who they were. And it was Gwen Carr and all of those folks. And as soon as I seen them, my sister was standing with me, and literally, we started crying, and we just hugged them. And from that embrace, we felt comforted because, as you mentioned, folks can be sympathetic, but the empathy part, you understand exactly what I'm feeling. You know, and as a brother, like in this network, I need the support of other families. These are the folks, literally, Uncle Bobby, we've been on the phone at times 3 in the morning, and he's on West Coast time, and I'm on East Coast time. You get what I'm saying? Josh has been a warrior for me. And then last thing I'll say, too, when you look around, when these families got to step up and do things, we don't know what to do. So when I think about the network, we've got folks like Josh and Dr. Collins. Everybody has a role to play. I can't do it all. But when I look out into the network, I'm grasping pieces, I'm grasping expertise from the experts there. But what I won't do is allow all these folks I'm collaborating to tell my story. I'm in control of that narrative, but I need the expertise of others to help me navigate how that narrative is perceived, how that narrative is putting out, and why. And I want to leave folks with this because all of us family members across the country, we're all in different stages of not just grief, but advocacy, pursuit of justice, pursuit of accountability. What I need to do for my brother may not work for the Henrys at the moment. What Nicole may be doing for her loved one 17 years later, I can learn from what they've done. So a lot of times it's just taking that expertise from folks, but understanding what does your network look like to you? Who are you surrounding yourself around to help not only, because, sorry, I'm babbling now, but what I'm trying to get to is to say, I'm never getting my brother back. He's not coming back. But what I do this for is for every single body else in this area. I need to make sure I'm making a change so you do not get the phone call that I got and join this club that has none of us asked to join. So that narrative is extremely important because that's eventually, we have to put laws in place that protect and dignify the lives of Black and brown people.
Dan, tell us about what you and Angela have learned.
I have to tell you, I'm not sure that anything surprised us, right? But you all came here to get something, right? So let me give you this. The justice system, as we've been referring to it, is designed in the U.S. to do exactly what it's done. Make no mistake about that. It's designed to do what it's done. It lacks accountability. There's not much oversight. It relies very heavily upon individual actors who have their own ambitions, sometimes political, sometimes racial, sometimes ethical. They have their own ambitions and their own limitations. And there's too much ability for people to act poorly when the facts and the evidence in front of them should suggest an outcome that is different from the one that we actually achieve. Now, that's the truth. So what do we have to do about that? We have to disrupt the system at every level, which is why we think a lot about liberation, not about the word justice, because it's a place they've created for us so that when things like this happen, they let us have that word. They let us rally around, get justice for this person, get justice for that person. But justice doesn't happen. It's an outcome of liberation, because liberation really is what is against that despotic form of control where these folks have absolute power and authority to make every decision, every judgment independently, unchecked. And so we have to disrupt that at every level. That starts with us, first of all, being clear about the language we use, right? Be clear about the language. Force them into a corner. Disrupt the pattern. Don't let them just say, well, we can defend against you calling us racist. We can defend against you saying you need justice. Can you defend against the facts? Can you defend against us just saying, give us the truth? Show us the evidence? Help us understand how the evidence supports your conclusion that this was a just outcome? Because then it takes it back to a fact-based argument, and it makes it harder for them to hide behind it. Look, they don't always ask you questions. Our son was asked no questions, not one. And so this notion that we sometimes pass around in our communities about have the talk. They give us that. You know why they give us that? Because it makes us feel safe. Because they allow us to walk around feeling like if we have the talk with our kids, nothing will ever happen to them. Well, absolutely not. They didn't ask our son a question. If they did, he'd be right here next to my wife. But he's not, because they never asked him a question. They shot him. He shot him without asking him a question. Right? So we have to begin to think differently in our own minds about how some of this stuff works. And our son, Kyle, our daughter, Amber, have suffered alongside of us, right? We talk about childhood trauma. These are adults who will never outlive that trauma. But they're fighters. They're fighters because we've said to them, you have to fight the way we're fighting this, right? Make sure that we don't give people the ability to say anything about our son, their brother, that isn't true. And the last thing I'll tell you is, look, he was his best defender. You know what they did first? They went to his Facebook page. You know why they went to his Facebook page? I was on the phone with a New York Times reporter who was writing a hit piece. And I took every interview in those days, every interview, friendly, not friendly. And I knew going in which one it was, I could tell. He was trying to write a hit piece, and he wanted me to be quoted because he had to legitimize the piece because he was going to try to hit our son hard. And he said to me, I looked on your son's Facebook page. Who is that kid? Who is that kid? His words, who is that kid that leaves a tribute to his parents on his Facebook page? That has scripture verses. Whether you believe that or not, he has verses. He talks about how he celebrates his parents, how he's trying to live a good life, how he's trying to do the right thing. Be excellent, because they can't fight against your reality, if what you leave for them is that reality. You got to own that. That's yours. That's a part of the narrative, but you speak your own language. You speak for yourself. Don't let anybody do that. Whether you're here or there, don't let them do that. Live your reality in a way today that makes it impossible to impugn you later.
Violet, Dan talks about being a fighter. You have been fighting for years, and I want you to tell us where your fight has led to when it comes to your brother and your cousin.
My fight has led to petitions. It has led to the parole boards. Brian and Celeste came home June 1st, 2023, 11 days before my 41st birthday. So that was a beautiful thing. But I'll leave you with this. Me and Dan were talking. Action, action, action. We sent so many petitions and support letters for their parole. We almost, just like 2 or 3, shut down their DOC website. Action, people. Get your family back, okay? Don't sit here and think that you can't be present at those parole board hearings. Your face, the community, people that didn't even know us, all the way over here in the East Coast, signed for their freedom. Action is what's going to bring your loved one home.
All right, y'all, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you to do this. I'm going to come to you, Josh, and you, Dr. Collins, and I want you, everyone here who's gathered is here because they want to learn, they want to know what they can do, they want to know what they should walk away with. From your experience, from your wisdom, from the lived experience you have on these kinds of stories and cases, what do you want people here to walk away with? What can they do so we are not back here next year having the same conversation over and over again?
Action, action, action. I was like, that's why I reached over. I don't believe in shutting up. And a lot of people along the way in this work have told me, well, you might not want to say that or do that. Now, you have to do it intelligently and respectfully, but in my experience, pressure breaks pipes. And you got to put that pressure on. And I mean it. I'll tell you, I'll leave you with this. I went on Joe Rogan. It wasn't a very popular decision, all right? Now, I went on Joe Rogan, and I said, well, I want to sit down and have a conversation with him so that the people that listen to that podcast can understand the voice of reason. Hopefully, I was the voice of reason. Because going on CNN is preaching to the converted. So I want to put pressure on. It led to me having, every quarter, I take an exoneree on with me, and they tell their story. I don't tell their story. I take them and they tell their story. I can tell you right now, it has led to the exoneration of 2 people. And I'll tell you why I know. Trisha Bushnell, who's in the audience, we were working on a case together. And I said, you know what? Lawrence, Kansas, I said it's the armpit. The armpit. And then I caught myself and I said, well, maybe poor choice of words. I said, if you're a person of color and you get accused of a crime, boy, watch out. A few weeks later, Trisha and I, with our co-counsel, went for a reverse proffer at the Lawrence County Police Department. All the detectives in the case, the district attorney's office. She walked in ceremoniously 8 or 9 minutes late and said, hello, Mr. Dubin, welcome to the armpit. And I said to myself, ooh, boy, motherfucker, I got you now. Now you're paying attention. Ron Torres Washington was exonerated about 2 months later. They pay attention. You put pressure on and break those pipes.
Dr. Collins, what do you want people to walk away with here?
I think the theme of action is really critical. I also want to just talk about stigma and shame, right? There's a lot of people that are impacted, but they don't want to take action. They don't want to talk about it because society stigmatizes and doesn't necessarily uplift people that are impacted by prisons and jails and police in general, right? So for me, when we think about, dismantling the cycle of, generational incarceration, generational adverse police interactions, we can think about the child, right? We know that there are statistics around school to prison pipeline, preschool to prison pipeline. The Children's Defense Fund released a report that highlighted the cradle to prison pipeline. So younger and younger, we're seeing children being matriculated into these correctional facilities. Now we could even argue there's a womb to prison pipeline. So we're thinking about babies that are being born in prisons and what's happening to them and their outcomes, right? So when we think about action and we think about, what does that look like for people, their everyday life, they are dealing with constant stressors, inequality, poverty, right? You don't have enough money to even go visit your loved one, enough money to even stay in touch with your loved one via the phone. And then you're also dealing with, like you mentioned, depression, right? Just trying to get out of this state of, I'm never gonna see this person again, or for a 4-year-old that may not see their parent until they're 45 years old, right? So what does it look like when you're in an early childhood setting, you have young children saying, I wanna grow up and be in prison like my dad? The implication of that is not that they want to go to prison like their dad, but they miss their dad. They miss their parent. They are longing for that connectedness with their caregiver. So when we think about action and we think about, how do we stop having this cycle of incarceration and also the cycle of adverse police interactions in general, we need to start talking about it, but we also need to work to develop support networks. And I think that's one thing that I really noticed working with families closely. I remember, I just want to share this, I think we have a few minutes. I worked with an elderly lady, she was in her 80s, and she was talking to other women that had adult incarcerated children. Well, they're adults, but they were their children, right? And they were dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of I don't even want to get up in the morning, I don't want to pay my bills, I just want to make sure my loved one has money on their books so that they can call me or they can get something to eat. And in the conversations, I could see how the support network was so important for women and caregivers, or even men and anyone that's taking care of children that are dealing with incarcerated loved ones. Being able to talk to one another created that sense of hope, right? They're dealing with a lot of helplessness, but being able to talk to each other and have our voices heard. But she said, I had 5 sons incarcerated at the same time. You can do this. You can get up and do this. And I remember when she said that, it was just this moment of silence. A lot of tears were shed, but also this moment of just hope, right? And so from that, they all started mobilizing each other, going to each other's pretrial hearings together, going with each other to visit their loved ones. Even if they couldn't go behind, they could sit in the waiting room and wait with each other. So when we think about action, I want to just uplift the importance of social support networks and really thinking about that and all the different stakeholders that I mentioned are invested in children and family well-being, thinking about educators, those that are working with children in schools. How are they being supported? How are they talking about this issue that often is not considered when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion in educational settings? We talk about children of the homeless, we talk about children with special needs, but there are a lot of children with incarcerated loved ones in our society that need to be talked about, and they need us to provide action for them as well. So I'll just leave you with that, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, y'all can see the clock as well as I can, right? But I pledge to have as much time for you to hear from these incredible leaders as possible. So let's just come back down the line. What do you want folks to take away? Violet, we will start with you. One last thought before we go.
I did say this. Everyone in life has that beacon. Keep your eye on that beacon, because that's your passion. I ended up in the criminal justice field. I'm a probation and parole officer. And the first thing that I say, because we have to infiltrate those structures, okay? We have to. Just like those supremacists do it for the political, we have to do it in the legal system as well. My first interview with all my clients is, my job is not to send you to prison. My job is to give you those resources so you are stable in this. And I have to meet them where they are. That single mother that has that toddler and no daycare. That man that is illiterate. Meet your people where they are. Do not dehumanize them. Do not label them as society already has. And you will learn those are your chosen family, okay? That is your chosen family. Meet them where they are. Follow your beacon.
Violet, thank you. Dan.
Yeah, I would offer you a couple of very specific actions that you can take if you live in New York right now. You can do this right now. So we were able to get, after our son was killed, was murdered, grand jury minutes now are public. They weren't then. That would have been incredibly helpful. Why? Because it shines a light on what DAs and assistant DAs are presenting to grand juries. Without that, you don't know. That's why there's a saying they can indict a ham sandwich if they want to. If they want to. Now you can see those minutes, so it holds them accountable. That's one. Two, special prosecutors, getting cases out of the DA's jurisdiction if the police department is in the same jurisdiction. Why? Lack of transparency. In our case, they just took what they said, which they later had to issue a public apology to us about, right? It was a total lie from the beginning. She prosecuted their lie. And she did it gleefully. She prosecuted their lie. She never looked for independent evidence or the real evidence. She just took what they told her to be the truth. The third thing we really should be thinking about in this state in particular is that the AG's office should have the ability to intervene in these cases. Because, you know why? Because then you can elect an AG every cycle, more than you can elect DAs. DAs are at the county level. You have one AG. You can focus, as Josh said, the pressure on the pipe at the AG level to make sure you have a progressive AG always sitting in that chair who will intervene appropriately in these cases. If you vote in New York, make sure you keep the pressure on the AG's office, whether it's Tish James or someone else. Keep the pressure on that office because that makes sure that you'll always have an AG sitting in that chair who will intervene. And the last thing is, we have a law that we're working on with Miriam Roker, who is the new DA of Westchester County, called DJ's Law. We hope that it will pass. It has to do with police officers using effective judgment when shooting at a moving vehicle. I don't know if it would have helped our son, because Aaron Hess shouldn't have been a police officer to begin with, but if it helps somebody else's son or daughter, we want to make sure that that gets passed.
Dan, thank you. Victor.
Yeah, really quick. I mean, a lot of panelists kind of said what I believe in, but I guess I want to say really quick is just action, but prioritize. Why is that important? Because we're blessed to be able to work in the field. You know, Legal Aid Society took a chance on me, helped me become an organizer. NAACP Legal Defense Fund took a chance on me and brought me on as an organizer. But had I not been working, I'm a chef by trade. I like to cook. That's what I do. But I remember when my brother was murdered, I was still working. I have to take care of my family. Like we mentioned earlier, we started off, life still goes on. But for us, it's like we're caught in a matrix. But we need the support of the advocates, not just the families that we call upon, but everyone else who's taken interest to even be here today. You get what I'm saying? Prioritize that. And the reason why that's so important, because a lot of the work that we're all doing, we had to prioritize our own time to educate ourselves. Conversations come and go, conversations happen, but you have to take the time out to educate yourself about your local laws, your local policies, because none of this work, everything that we're doing, it's gonna go to a policy, it's gonna go to a vote, it's gonna talk about through our legislative sessions. I didn't understand this, censor. I didn't understand this 8 years ago. I am formerly incarcerated, I am gangbanging, that's who I am, that's who I am as a person, but it doesn't make me less than anybody else. Action and prioritize. That's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you for that real-time censor there, too. Nicole, take us home.
So I just want to leave you guys with this. Never give up. Never give up. We are all on borrowed time. The question is, what are you guys going to do with your time? Here. Right? The question is, what are we going to do with the time that we have here? So for me, my time, it's never give up. We have to continue to push forward, remain active, and always remember that if you continue to push and you continue to use the gift that God gave you or the gift that you have that you've used, no one ever can take that from you. Don't be so distracted with your today that you forget your tomorrow. Never give up.
I'll loop it back to what Dr. Dyson said in quoting Robert Frost, and miles to go before we sleep. Folks, please join me in thanking these incredible leaders, Dr. Patrice Collins, Josh Dubin, Violet Martin, Ann Henry, Victor Dempsey, and Nicole Paultre-Bell. Thank you all for being here as well.